Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu
Eloheinu melech haolam
Bachar Banu
banu
Mikol
michol
Amim
amamim
Nasan Lanu
banu
Es Taraso Baruch
baruch atah
Nai
Adonai
Nosein
nosein
HaTorah
haTorah.
Shema
Shema
Yisrael
El
Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. That's Russell. Say hi, Russell. Okay, let's get started. So last week was our class got rudely interrupted by the computer. So this week, God willing, we won't have these snafus. And we were actually, I believe somehow we came to a perfect ending point anyway, which is pretty remarkable, unless I'm confused. But I think we just got to the end of Yanai's pretty disastrous reign. And we were about to talk about the one nice spot in the entire Hashmona'i dynasty. How not surprising that this is when a woman ruled. Now it's interesting, I don't know if any of you remember, but I told you, let's go back. The second Hashmona'i ruler was Yochanan Hyrcanus. If you remember, first it was his father, Simon, Shimon, the last of the original 5 Maccabee brothers. And then it was Shimon's son. Yeah. It was Shimon's son, the one that survived, because remember the others were murdered by the son-in-law in a coup to try to take the throne. Was Yochanan Hyrcanus, who, if you remember, was very righteous for most of his life, very righteous, and at the end, boom, went 180 degrees the other direction. When Yochanan Hyrcanus passed away, in his will, he said that the throne should be given to his wife. But his sons did not listen. Again, if you remember the history, the oldest son grabbed the throne and imprisoned his brothers. And when this son passed away, about a year or two later, it never went back to the mother. Then the next son, Yanai, married the wife of the oldest son, Yehuda Aristobulus, and he had the throne for 27 very bad years for the Jewish people. Now, interestingly enough, when Yanai passed away, he said that the throne should go to his wife. So I thought that was interesting that like father, like son, both of them recognized that the woman would have a different way of ruling perhaps than they had ruled, and probably a better way. And this was definitely true for the wife of Yanai, who again, if we remember, because we mentioned her before, and she has a few different names. We see in the Talmud, we see in Jewish history a few different names from her. Sometimes she's called Shlomis Alexandra. She's also sometimes called Shlomtziyon. Sometimes she's called Salome. And but this is the same woman. The queen, the wife originally of Yehuda Aristobulus, the oldest son of Yochanan Hyrcanus. And we said that when she was married, her father-in-law, Yochanan Hyrcanus, was a very, very righteous person. So he picked a very, very righteous daughter-in-law for his oldest son, Yehuda Aristobulus, which was this woman, Shlomis Alexandra, Shlomtziyon, who, as we said, had this very illustrious brother, Shimon ben Shattach, and had tried, if you remember, during the time of Yanai's reign, had tried to keep the peace between Yanai and what we call the Perushim, the sages, the ones loyal to Judaism. We said originally she was sort of able to sort of keep the peace, and then it exploded, and Yanai went on this rampage murdering out the sages, and then she was able to calm that down. But then again, if you remember, when he poured the water on Sukkot on his feet instead of on the altar, again, it was a horrific, horrific, horrific rampage against the righteous Jews and the common Jews at that time. He actually ordered the execution of 800 sages. Can you imagine what that means? What a treasury of Torah that is? What a treasury of Judaism that is? 800 of the holiest people, Yanai had brutally executed. So now Shlomtziyon, his very, very, very righteous wife, is given the throne. she didn't rule that long. I actually tried. It wasn't clear. Based on the figures that I saw, she ruled for about 8 years. I mean, the entire dynasty of the Hashmonaim was about 104 years. And she ruled for 8 of those years. And those were the respite, 8 years, the best years, the only really good years in the entire Hashmonai dynasty. Why? Because she was a very righteous person. She was a sister of Shimon ben Shattach. She was a very, very righteous person. So when she ruled, front and center in front of her eyes was Torah, was what does God want? And because that was her call, because that was how she ruled her country, the country prospered in an amazing way. And again, that's such a beautiful and powerful lesson to us as women. We can understand that the woman, men have an easier ego trap. Women are a little more remote from that. There were some disastrous women leaders of the Jews also. We're not going to say not. But in general, we've seen that the women had a special quality, even among the very righteous. We didn't teach this era of history. I don't know if I mentioned it because we sort of quickly overviewed it. And I mentioned then that if you remember the era of the judges, right? First we had Moshe, then we had his successor, Joshua, Yeshua, and then we had a period of judges until the kings. And I remember discussing this actually at length, how we said this was an amazing concept because the judges had no real political power, but they ruled the Jewish people because this was what God wanted. This Torah authority should rule, and the people were on the level to live that way. So the judges in general were all very holy people. And yet, the best reign of the entire spectrum of the judges was when a woman was the judge. The officiating judge, the highest judge of the land, was a woman named Devorah. And Devorah reigned for a very long time. In those days, she reigned for 40 years, which was very, very long for that time. And her time was the most peaceful time, the most prosperous time during the entire time of the judges, when they were all good. They were all righteous. Every judge was righteous. And still, it was a uniquely special time. And here, how much more so when we're surrounded by all this corruption, by all these kings that were so not righteous. Her husband, Yanai, before that, her husband, Yehuda Aristobulus. Unfortunately, the last year of her father-in-law, who was otherwise righteous, Yochanan Horkanus. And then going afterwards, oh my gosh, it gets worse and worse and worse, let me tell you. So we have here this beam of light when this woman who has the humility, the sensitivity to understand that if you want to do it right, you do it God's way. And if that, again, that maybe takes a woman to know that. To know that if you want to do it right, do it God's way. And when you do it God's way, it works. So that's an amazing practical lesson for all of us and whatever we're going through in our life. We, just like, of course, everyone sort of knows what's happening next week in America. And some people have a lot of nervousness and concerns and this and that. You just have to go back to this basic concept. We're Jews. We do it God's way. Is it because women are more spiritual? I think because women are more spiritual, that goes hand in hand with women having less ego. It's sort of all part of the same package deal. Women are the manifestation of God's feminine dimension. God's feminine dimension is the dimension of creation. The creation is the idea of being a nurturer, as women are the nurturers of godliness, as creation is nurturing that godliness. So as such, we have more of an affinity, more of a sensitivity to God. And therefore, we also have it a little bit easier to escape the ego trap of me and my power and my authority. We're not immune, obviously. I'm not claiming that. That would be a very racist comment, right? but we have a little bit of more sensitivity to God, and therefore I think a bit of an easier time not thinking it's coming from me, but acknowledging it comes from God. So the less you're into that ego space, the less you're this power hungry, I need to be strong, I need to make sure to squash everyone, I need to control more. All of the traps of the kings before and after her. Meaning Shlomtziyon, Shlomis Alexandra, I'll give you a very clear indication of the difference. She maintained an army, not a mercenary army, Remember, the mercenary armies were the armies where they hired foreigners, Gentiles, that were fighting our wars. Obviously, they had no loyalty. Obviously, it was just a money racketed thing. And the kings had them before and after her. Well, afterwards, we'll see what happens. But before her, to expand the territories, to conquer more, to conquer more, to conquer more. And she was like, what do we need this for? That's not what God's telling us to do. Conquer more, conquer more, conquer more. I need to maintain an army so that we're strong, so we're safe, so we're secure, so nobody starts us with us. But that's it. That's all we're looking to do. So that's such a different perspective than all the male kings before her. Again, that's the nurturer element. That's the more sensitive to God element of like, if God is telling me to conquer more, we'll go for it. Otherwise, what am I doing that for? That's not going to help my country. That's not going to help my people. I just need more power, more power, more power. I have to think I'm ruler over more and more and more lands. That's not what I'm in this for. I'm in this really to help do exactly what a ruler is supposed to do. Connect the people to God. Lead the people. Help the people. Give the people the best life possible. And we see that God followed suit. Meaning our sages say that during the time of Shlomtziyon, again, there's this 8 years of her reign, it rained on Friday nights. We're told that's like when God in his kindness is, maybe now it might not seem convenient, but the idea of raining on Friday nights is because then the people are generally home celebrating the Sabbath. They're not going out during the week. They have to go out. They have to work. They have to deal with things. At night, Friday night, they're home. They're enjoying their Sabbath with their family. So that's, we're told, traditionally is the best time for the rain to fall. It won't disturb people. And we're told the rain was so bountiful, and it only fell one night a week, that everything grew so bountifully. The crops were so large and so bountiful. So the people were so prosperous. So this was not only a political respite, that we're not focused on expanding and therefore stripping our resources to conquer more. Also from within, each person had so much food. Each person was so comfortable and so secure. Now, was that because she was a great ruler that she figured out how to make the rains fall better? No, it was because God was on her side. So again, this goes back to these same very foundational lessons. When you do it God's way, God makes it work. No human can create the rain to fall when you want and how you want and make the crops grow in that way. But God can. So why did God do it for her? Because she was reigning for him. Because she was doing whatever she could to make this a godly country. So God followed suit. It's like Maimonides said, I know we've quoted this before, but I think it's a very important concept. Maimonides says, when you do it God's way, when you're committed to God, he will pour on you the good and remove from you the bad, not as your reward. Maimonides says reward is in the afterlife. Reward is in the heavens, Gan Eden. Reward is Mashiach, the Messianic times. Reward isn't in this world. So why is God pouring on you the good and taking away the bad? Because you want to serve him, so he's going to make it possible. If we're all burdened and distracted by all the other junk we have to deal with, how can we possibly serve him? So Shlomtziyon's time was such an example of this because she was so committed to serving him, and she did everything in her powers to make this a righteous, God-fearing country. So God made it work. God made it a time when the good was plentiful and the bad wasn't there. So during the entire time of her reign, the nations are not attacking. They had no attacks from the outside countries, no attacks from the foreign countries, and they weren't trying to conquer any of the foreign countries. What did they have for 8 years? They had this very rare commodity in those days. They had peace. They had peace. And what did she do with the peace? Well, what she did was she tried to restore the power to Torah, to the Sanhedrin. Unfortunately, the Sanhedrin is the highest governing body of Torah. But because Yanai was so against the sages, and of course the Sanhedrin had a certain power, as we'll see soon when the Romans take over, it takes till their second leader and they dismantle the Sanhedrin, not because they cared about the religion, but because they understood it was the power. And they didn't want Jews to have that power. So the Sanhedrin had the power, so as such, many Tzaddukim, I'm sorry, for some reason it said like that. It wasn't plugged in properly. Trying to figure out what's going on there. Okay, situation solved. So the Sanhedrin, since it was a place of power, now we think of it as a place of this righteous meeting grounds of 71 sages. You know, today, of course, they swore in a new Supreme Court justice, right? So we're a little bit focused on that concept. Well, imagine if the country was ruled through that body. Of course, we know in America, we have the executive branch, the president, we have the congressional branch, right? The Senate, the House of Representatives, and we have the judicial branch, the Supreme Court. From a Torah perspective, the judicial branch, the Supreme Court of 71 sages, not of 9, of 71 sages, that is supposed to be the voice of Torah, which ultimately, in a sense, becomes a voice of rulership of the Jewish people, because in the ideal world of God's vision, the king, the executive dimension, and the Sanhedrin are working hand in hand. The king listens to the Sanhedrin, the Supreme Court, the judiciary branch. The king understands that they have a wisdom of Torah that he doesn't have. And the king, of course, is leading the people, but under their guidance. Now, of course, as we know, that's not what happened. Under Yochanan and Hyrcanus, there was that underlying tension between him and the Sanhedrin, because he knew that they disapproved of his rule, because it was supposed to go back to the house of David. And how much more so under Yanai, where it became this war, and Yanai tried to kill out all the people of Sanhedrin. So when all of the sages fled, what happened to this power? I mean, the official court structure existed, but the sages couldn't be there, because the sages, if they were in Israel, they would be killed. As we said, unfortunately, many were tortured and executed. So what happened was Tzedukim infiltrated the Sanhedrin. Why did the Tzedukim infiltrate the Sanhedrin? Because of the power, not because they were righteous, not because they wanted people to know what is truly God's will, but because this is a place of power. They understood there was a lot of power here. So when Shlomtziyon, when Shlomo Alexandra takes over, one of the first things she does is she gives the sages the ability to remove from the Sanhedrin all of these Tzedukim, all of these non-righteous, non-loyal to God people that had sort of, if you will, bought their seats on this Supreme Court, because of course they understood there was a lot of power in that place. So that was the first thing she did. She cleaned it out. We're going to have 71 loyal to God sages. Now, she did not go being very wise, and obviously she had the counsel of her brother, Shimon ben Shattach, who was the head of the sages and was her brother, was obviously probably giving her a lot of this wise guidance. She did not. Okay, I will. Just 1 second. He wants me to lock the door. I imagine guided by her brother, or maybe she just had the wisdom to understand it herself. She did not go on a war of vengeance against all the Tzedukim. Meaning, again, if you remember the history of her husband's 27 years, her husband didn't start out a Tzeduki. His father, at the end of his life, poisoned by years and years and years of the Tzedukim feeding him all this libelous talk against the sages, twisted and became a Tzeduki. Yanai didn't start out a Tzeduki, but then again, he had the Tzedukim influencing him, and convincing him the sages hated him, and convincing him the sages were trying to depose him. So therefore, he twisted and became Tzeduki-like. So there were all these Tzedukim that had done horrible things and really been the ones that convinced her husband, convinced Yanai, to become the Tzeduki. He didn't start out that way on his own. He didn't start out saying, I'm a Tzeduki. He wasn't thinking he was a Tzeduki. He wasn't trying to be a Tzeduki until the Tzedukim convinced him that they're his friends and the sages hate him, to such a degree that he went all out and executed as many as he could find. So Shlomtziyon did not try to take revenge against the Tzedukim. The only Tzedukim that she did have killed were the ones that massacred those 800 sages. Again, remembering the history, as I just reminded you of earlier, after Yanai, now he's officially the Tzeduki and he's the high priest, which sounds like such an incongruous blend to us, but that's what it was like in those days. So he was supposed to, on the Sukkot holiday, pour the water on the altar. Instead, he poured the water on his feet. The nation was aghast at the sacrilegious conduct. They started pelting him with their esrogim, and he had his army come and massacre them. Thousands died then, just in the war, so to speak. But then when everything settled down, they gathered whatever sages they could find. They had 800 sages that they murdered, that they executed. So the people that were responsible for murdering those 800 sages, she did have them killed. But all the other, just one second. Right. But all the other Tzedukim, she just felt like, we're not going to go there. I don't want this to become like my war against the Tzedukim, because right now the Jewish people can't afford any wars. Yes, I'm removing them from their power in the Sanhedrin. I'm removing them from their positions of power. I'm removing those people that murdered those 800 sages. But besides that, we want to work on repairing. We want to work on restoring. So that was her goal. We're in this together. We're all Jews. We want to work on maintaining our relationship with each other, rebuilding these bridges that have been destroyed. And it's interesting, we see this in the light of the sages as well. If you look back at the sages and the teachings of those days, there was this emphasis by the sages also of, like, on one hand, staying loyal to God, but at the same time, being tolerant of the people, not trying to be vengeful, not trying to be judgmental. That's not the way to go. That's not what God wants from us. We have to try to build, not try to, like, judge and say this one's not worthy and this one's not worthy and this one's not worthy. So just as the sages were preaching that, that's not our position. We're not looking to say this one's taboo, this one's taboo, this one's taboo, this one did wrong, this one did wrong, this one did wrong. That's not our perspective. Right now, Shlomtziyon is the ruler. Right now, it's the time, the era when God's on the throne, so to speak. And we're not going to start trying to take revenge on all those people that were hurting us for those 27 horrific years. We're going to move forward. We're going to build, which of course is very important and very, very essential for us to keep in mind today. Obviously, that's the perspective we're supposed to have. We can leave vengeance to God. We can leave judgment to God. We're supposed to build. We're supposed to focus on the good in people and not the bad. So basically, her goal was for there to be a balance between the physical and spiritual life of the Jews. For the Jews to have a full spiritual life and for it to be physically very, very good, because when you're doing it God's way, it should work. And in her times, it did work. Now, it's sort of interesting because historically we could wonder if she was so righteous, and she was. We have no blemish against her. She was completely righteous, as we see. So why didn't she restore the throne to the house of David? In other words, we said, and we've echoed this concept many times, that the Hashmonaim's fatal flaw, error, weakness, was that they took the throne. Even though Shimon, the first of them, and his son, Yochanan Horkonis, were too righteous to call themselves kings, but de facto they were. And already starting with Yochanan Horkonis, the son Yehuda Aristobulus, I mean, he already, of course, was not so righteous and definitely called himself a king, as did all the remaining rulers of the Hashmonaim dynasty. So Shlomtziyon's righteous. She's totally connected to her brother, the leader of the sages, Shimon ben Shattach. She would listen to anything he said. So why didn't they give back the throne to David then? That's a question. We don't have an answer for it. But it's something we're trying to understand historically. Obviously, it wasn't something they forgot. Obviously, it was a significant point. Why didn't they do that? And there's various answers given, but it's an interesting question to wonder. When you finally have an opportunity, why didn't it happen? Some say maybe at that point, who knows? Maybe there was no worthy person from the house of David that the sages felt they could rely on. Maybe they felt everything was so fragile and tenuous. If they suddenly took away Shlomtziyon, who was from the Hashmonai dynasty, and just put some new guy on the throne, it would be a signal to all the enemies around Judea to say, oh, there's some infighting or something weird going on. Let's use this to attack. Maybe. Others, maybe the most plausible thought is that the sages understood that if they did this, Shlomtziyon's two sons might cause a civil war at this point. As unfortunately we're going to see happens after she passes away. A disastrous war that destroyed Hashmonaim and destroyed Israel completely. Completely. So maybe they understood that, again, remember, when Yochanan Horkonis said to his sons, your mother, my wife, is going to rule after Yehuda Aristobulus, ignored that, imprisoned his brothers, and he took the throne. when Yanai said, my wife, Shlomtziyon, is going to rule after me, the two brothers, Hyrcanus and Aristobulus, as we're going to discuss them soon, they listened. But maybe they listened knowing their mother's old. She was. I mean, she reigned for 8 years. She's not going to last that long. We can be respectful. We can be respectful. It's okay. She's a good woman. We can be respectful. It's all right. Our turn is coming soon. But maybe if she stepped down and had some young person from the house of David as now, okay, I'm doing the right thing, forget Chashmonaim, let's restore the kingship, maybe they would have rebelled then, and who knows, that maybe the sages were just too scared of another civil war. We don't know the answer. We don't see it mentioned anywhere. It's not mentioned anywhere in the Talmud, anywhere in the Medrash. Nobody talks about this. So obviously it never came up officially during her reign, but it's a big question, because why not? It seems like so obvious that that's what should have happened then. So sometimes, even and we're not saying they did anything wrong. I'm not doing anything wrong here, because we don't see it being wrong of her. It just, maybe the sages made the calculation. Look at everything going on. This peace that Shlomtziyon has restored is so tenuous, we don't want to, as we would say, rock the boat. Which, of course, sometimes is in our lives as well. That sometimes we know the right thing to do, and we feel like we've got to figure out a way to do it that nothing shatters in the process. So maybe the sages were scared too much would shatter in the process. But this piece of Shlomtziyon was very tenuous. It barely survived her, and did not at all pass on to the next generation. So to understand why now, we have to understand a little bit what was going on in the next generation. So Shlomtziyon and Yanai had 2 sons. The oldest son's name was Hyrcanus. The second one's name was Aristobulus. On her demise, there's 2 great positions that are supposed to happen. One is who's the high priest. Now, of course, Shlomtziyon was a woman, she wasn't the high priest. But until now, the Chashmonai ruler had also been the high priest and also been the king. Not supposed to be the king, but was the king. So she had her older son, Hyrcanus, who was more soft-spoken, seemingly seems to us at that point at least closer to God, but weaker, much weaker. Then she had her second son, Aristobulus, who was much stronger and who was very, very, very ambitious. So already before she passed away, it was very obvious there was going to be a lot of friction here between the 2 of them. What's going to happen when she's gone? So again, we have this 8-year breathing space. Imagine living in this time, having survived Yanai, having had these 8 years that were good, almost as if God's just giving them the strength for what's going to come in the future, because it was really bad. Even before she passed away, it already got not bad in any way that the people experienced it, but already we saw what was going to happen. Because Shlomtziyon felt that the ruler should be Hyrcanus. He was the older of the 2, so he should follow her. And she knew he would much more likely follow the sages. Not that we see that Aristobulus had anything per se against the sages. He didn't. He wasn't a tzedukah, at least at any level that we were seeing. But she just saw from his personality, he was much more likely to want to, go out there with a lot of, and, take whatever he could and grab it and run. So Hyrcanus seemingly was the one that would be more willing to comply and listen to the sages and follow their rule, which he would have been. So she wanted Hyrcanus to be the ruler. But as she got older, again, I don't know what age she was when she passed away. And again, in those days, older might have been different than today. But as she was getting older and weaker, her brother Shimon ben Shattach passed away. So he passed away before her. So now she's old, physically she's weaker, and her brother, who she was relying on for counsel and support and guidance, was gone. Now she's still the queen. Everyone loved her. No one was at all trying to take away from her the reign. But she was just physically getting frail, and she had this lot of pressure from Aristobulus. So Aristobulus started harassing her, very viciously harassing her, not like sweet-talking her, that he must be given the Chashmonai fortresses, which have within them the Chashmonai treasures. And he said, again, he wasn't trying to be a sweet son that she would listen because he's so good. He understood that his mother he knew that his mother knew that it would be better for the people, Hyrcanus, because he would have led the people under the guidance of the sages, and Shlomtziyon knew that would be the best thing for them. So he knew that's what his mother was thinking. So he was just flat out, if you don't give me these fortresses, if you don't give me these treasures, I'm going to ally myself with the Arab king, and I'm going to start a war. Now, again, in theory, she should have just said, go fly a kite. Because what is she helping by giving him fortresses and treasures to finance his war? But again, nobody in any way is feeling she did anything wrong here on any moral level. She didn't have the support. She was physically frail, and she just gave in to her son, sort of hoping against hope that maybe, I don't know how this could end in good, but I don't know. You know, sometimes mothers, sometimes all of us, it just sort of shows, you know, obviously we, in all of this, always try to understand how this reflects our own lives. You know, maybe we always need to have that counsel. We always need to have that support, even if we're, again, like Shlomtziyon, who was completely righteous. And even here, no one's saying she was not righteous. Nobody is judging her as she was sinning by doing this. It was a big problem for the Jewish people. It was a critical mistake, but no one's blaming her for making that critical mistake. But what we can learn from it, because of course in everything in life we're supposed to understand it, and a big point in history is understanding where we came from, to understand where we are, to understand where we're going to, and to understand the lessons we learn in history. So I think here you see a lesson here, the very righteous person who had led the people for, I mean, she led them for 8 years, and she was an amazing ruler. She was a godly ruler. Her call was, what does God want? What are the sages telling me? What's Torah's approach? And we see all the good that came to the Jewish people during her reign. But you always need support. You always need counsel. If it's as we would call it, a mashpia figure, someone that's your spiritual mentor, if it's a rabbi, a rav that you turn to, that you know you're not gonna make the decisions yourself. You're gonna consult with him. If she had had someone like that, she probably would not have given over the fortresses and the treasures to Aristobulus, because she would have had the strength to say, this is what Torah told me to do. Sorry, go fly a kite. But because she didn't have that support, because her brother, of course, God coordinated the world. God could have made her brother live past her. God ran the show. God, you know, we always have to keep that in mind. Like, everything that happens is exactly God's will. And sometimes when God's will aligns with what we think is best, or we know is best, or we see as best, we see as good, so we're like, wow, the hand of God, that's so amazing. Guess what? Everything's the hand of God. All the stuff that we don't like is the hand of God also. Every time it works, wow, it's the hand of God. Every time we would say it doesn't work, wow, it's the hand of God. Everything is the hand of God. God plotted this whole thing out. It's a really sad story we're going to learn. And God plotted the whole thing out. People made choices. People made bad choices. People made horrific mistakes. But everything is the hand of God. So again, if God had wanted, Shimon ben Shattach could have lived past Shlomtziyon. And then for sure, Shlomtziyon would not have given the treasures and the fortresses to Aristobulus. And then history could have looked very different. But God in his wisdom said, this is the road it's going to be. This is the road. This is the road. So it's good for us always to know that when we look and we see like, wow, the hand of God in that salvation, which of course is true, every single thing that happens is a hand of God. And it's all for good. It's all ultimately the road leading to Mashiach. Everything that looks to us as going direct and everything that looks to us as a horrific detour, it's all part of the road going to Mashiach. When we look in our life and we celebrate, we rejoice in the hand of God. And when things happen in this world that make us feel like, what is going on? Trust. It's the hand of God. It's the hand of God. And it's also part of this road to Mashiach. So therefore, God had that Shimon ben Shattach had already passed away before Shlomtziyon. And therefore, Shlomtziyon was weakened. And of course, as we're saying, we can learn from this, always have that rabbi, that rav, that mashpia, that mentor. But she did not at this point, though she definitely would have wanted one. And therefore, she was too weak for Aristobulus' pressures, and she was very fearful of this civil war he was threatening, though actually that's exactly what happened. But she gave him the fortresses, she gave him the treasures. That didn't mean she thought he should be the king. So what was she doing? I don't know what she was doing. She just was too frail to resist. But before she passed away, she clearly said, my successor is Hyrcanus. She told the sages they can do whatever they want to take away the power from Aristobulus. She is not giving Aristobulus the throne. Yes, he did get out of her the fortresses. He got out of her the treasures. She's not giving him the throne. She doesn't want him to have the throne. She wants Hyrcanus to have the throne, and she wants Hyrcanus to listen to the sages and to continue ruling as she had ruled, a loyal to God reign that brought such blessings for the Jewish people. Guess what? Nothing like that happened at all. But that was truly what she was hoping for. Though, of course, she had already given Aristobulus all of this power. Now, at that point, so here she passed away, this very righteous ruler, the only true ruler from the entire Hashmonite period that we view as a righteous ruler, and definitely see this realized. I mean, even Shimon, who was of the Maccabees, but still, he took the throne instead of giving it to David, and he was totally bent on wars of expansion. And again, the fact that she was not trying to have wars of expansion, to us, shows us her righteousness, showed us that she understood it's not a power trip. It's about what's best for the Jewish people. What does God want? And that's not what God wants, and that's not best for the Jewish people. So that, if anything, shows that she was truly thinking not about me and my honor and my prestige, but what's good for the people. What does God want? She passed away, as I'm saying, a woman like Devorah that led the Jews for a much shorter time, but very, very, very well. Right when she's gone, again, I don't know if it was that day, Aristobulus declares himself the ruler. Now, remember, she had officially said, and she told the sages of the time, I am giving the throne to Hyrcanus. I want him to rule. I know he will follow you. I want you with him to rule. Remember, the executive branch should be Hyrcanus. The judiciary branch should be the Sanhedrin. And the Sanhedrin should guide the king. And it would be, just as her reign had been, a beautiful, peaceful reign for the Jewish people. But again, that wasn't in the plots. That was not in the script. That did not happen at all. Because right away, Aristobulus said, I'm the king. Now, at this point, the sages had a choice. The sages could say, nothing doing. Your mother, the queen, officially declared, there's no arguing it, legally declared that Hyrcanus, who happens to be the oldest son, is her successor. You're not the king, and we're going to fight you. The sages did not do that. Why did they not do that? Probably because the Jewish people had suffered so much. Again, Shlomtziyon had those beautiful 8 years. Before then were 27 bloody years. Yanai's years, if you remember, as we learned last week and the week before, were very, very hard years of so much civil unrest, of so many Jewish lives lost, that probably the sages felt, we can't go down that road. They foresaw correctly, because that's exactly what happened, what would be if we just get entrenched in another civil war. Okay, this isn't what we want. This isn't what Shlomtziyon wants. Let him rule. Let him be, as we say in Hebrew, Gamze Ya'avar. He'll be the king. We'll survive. He wasn't at this time rabidly a Tzeduki. His followers were Tzedukim, but the sages felt if they didn't oppose him, he wasn't necessarily going to go to the Tzeduki camp. He wasn't per se thinking, I want to be a Tzeduki. He just wanted the power. He cared about the power. He didn't care about if he was a Tzeduki or not. So the sages felt, fine, let it be. Let Aristobulus rule. It'll be okay. And in theory, they were 100% right. But again, that wasn't the script, so that's not what happened. But in theory, that would have been good. What was the problem? The problem was that there was another person that got involved and for his own gain massively messed this entire story up. Meaning, at this point, Shlomtziyon is gone. She says Hyrcanus should be the ruler. Aristobulus already had the treasure houses and the fortresses, and he was using that to mobilize an army. And he had the Tzeduki followers, because the Tzedukim understood they would have more leverage with Aristobulus than with Hyrcanus, because they understood Hyrcanus would follow the sages, which he would have. So, civil war, the sages say, we don't want the civil war. Aristobulus, fine. We give in to you, be the king. So Aristobulus is great, I'm the king. And seemingly, it's not 100% clear historically, but seemingly he allowed his brother to be the high priest. He didn't really care. Like, he didn't need to be the high priest. He was fine. Let him be the king. Let his brother be the high priest. So we're sort of splitting it up. And it could have ended at that point. And then life would have continued for better or for worse. Who knows what would have happened next? But again, God had different ideas, and therefore it went a very, very, very bad path. What would have happened? Again, we don't know what could have happened then, but since Aristobulus didn't seem to be really a tzedukah, he was just using the tzedukim to gain power. He cared about power. That's what he wanted. So maybe Aristobulus would have made peace with the sages because he understood the people would listen to the sages. So if he really wanted to cement his power, he really, in a sense, needed the sages on his side so he wouldn't be in friction with the people. So in theory, Hyrcanus could have been the high priest, he could have been the king, he would have made peace with the sages, and his reign would have continued, and who knows what would have been the script of Jewish history. That's not what happened. Why is that what happened? Because of a certain person. It's very interesting when you can really see historically how one person did such damage. Sometimes one person can do such good. I mean, look at Abraham, right? Abraham. He brought monotheism to this world. He brought the world to recognition of God. One person can change the whole world for good in amazing ways. The power of good is much more than the power of evil. But of course, sometimes, as we have seen in modern history and in the past, again and again and again, you can have one person, and he can literally change the course of history for his own selfish gains. So the person that did this here is a person named Antipater Ha'edomi. Now, who was this Antipater Ha'edomi? If you remember, and if you forgot, that's fine. It was a while ago. I had emphasized this point that Hyrcanus, I'm sorry, not Hyrcanus, that his father, Shimon, was his father Shimon, I'm pretty sure. I just want to check because I don't want to teach the wrong thing. Now I'm confused. Was Hyrcanus or Shimon? No, it was Hyrcanus, sorry. Let me say it correctly. Hyrcanus. If you remember, when he conquered the Edomim, he made this critical, fatal mistake, secularly and spiritually, by forcing them to convert. I don't know if people remember that, but I emphasized the point how it's inconceivable how he did this, because at this time, Hyrcanus was seemingly a very religious person. And of course, we discourage converts. We don't force conversion. So it's completely against Jewish law. And I emphasize then to you that when we don't do it God's way, it gets messed up, not just spiritually, but physically as well. And I said that because of what he did, ultimately his whole home was destroyed. The entire house of the Hashmonaim was massacred because of this forced Edomi conversion. So now we're going to see what I meant. We don't see that yet. That's going to be soon. But we're going to see the groundwork for that. So this person, Antipater Ha'edomi, so he was an Edomi, he had convinced Yanai that he should become the ruler over the Edomi area, like the governor, because he said, listen, I'm one of them, so they're going to be more compliant of one of their own rules. Antipater Ha'edomi was really smart and shrewd and scheming and cunning, and he wanted more and more and more and more and more power. Now, officially, he's Jewish. Of course, he wasn't Jewish. But officially, he's Jewish because Hyrcanus had officially made all the Edomim Jewish. And of course, they weren't Jewish. And I don't know how they viewed themselves. They probably said if they wanted to view themselves as Jewish, they viewed themselves as Jewish, but they knew the other Jews didn't really view them as Jewish at all. So they also had this sort of like, second caste identity crisis, if you will, or a hatred of the Jews for not accepting them as Jews when they really weren't Jews. He had a lot of money, which he had inherited. He had now power because he's controlling this whole Edomi area. And he was a very, very shrewd, conniving, politically savvy individual. So he's looking at what's happening between these two brothers, between Hyrcanus and Aristobulus. Remember, Hyrcanus is the older one. He's the one who's officially supposed to be the king, but he's definitely a weaker character. Aristobulus was younger, was stronger. Before his mother passed away, already gathered the forces and the money. And Aristobulus said, I don't care what my mother said, I'm the king. And basically the sages backed off and said, fine, be the king. Hoping, praying for peace. And in theory, that could have happened. But Antipater Ha'edomi said, this is my call to action. Why? Because right now, Hyrcanus is going to be my little puppet. I'm going to go to Hyrcanus. I'm going to convince Hyrcanus that what's going on. What a chutzpah. He's supposed to be the king. His mother said he's supposed to be the king. And I'm going to throw all my support and money and power to get him to be the king. Because, of course, if he's the king, that means I'm the king. Because he's going to be my puppet. With Aristobulus, Aristobulus isn't going to let him be his puppet. And I have no room with Aristobulus. He already became the king. He doesn't need me at all. I'm just a governor of some province of his kingdom. But if I get Hyrcanus and I'm the one that makes him the king, first of all, he's very weak. And he knows he owes my money and my power. And he's going to be scared to start up with me. So I'm going to be able to be the power behind the throne, maybe the power on the throne. So that was Antipter's perspective. And as such, he started talking. Now, again, he's a powerful, influential person. He's been the ruler of this area of Edom. Again, it's an area under the Judea control, but he's like the governor of this area. He's very wealthy. He's very powerful. He's very politically conniving and smart. And he starts talking to Hyrcanus. He starts flattering him. He starts telling him how he's really king material, how this is such a travesty. He's supposed to be the king. This is the wishes of his dead mother. And he basically egged him on and egged him on and egged him on and promised him, of course, all the support he would ever need if he would only rebel and proclaim himself king. Because again, Antipter knew he's king, that means I'm king. Aristobulus is king, I got nothing. Aristobulus is king, that doesn't do me any good. Hyrcanus is king, I'm the king. And unfortunately, that's exactly what happened. And he incited Hyrcanus. Again, flattery is a very devious tool. Hyrcanus was weak. He had any illusions. He was a high priest and fine. But when Antipter keeps talking to him and flattering him and convincing him, he fell prey. And again, as our sages warn us of bribes, it says bribes blind the eyes of the wise. So when someone wants something from you and they keep flattering you and telling you these false things, that's a type of bribery. It's a type of blinding of your eyes. And that's exactly what happened here. And of course, this isn't the only time in history this has happened. And of course, it's a lesson for us to always be wary of such people that are really looking for their own power. And obviously, Antipter couldn't care less about the Jewish people and the fate of the Jewish people. He wasn't Jewish. He was just a foreigner claiming to be Jewish for gain, as unfortunately we've seen also in our past and in our present. So now what does Antipter do now? Again, Hyrcanus, which means Antipter. What did they do? Because they knew Aristobulus had a big army, right? He massed this army to become the king, and he still had his army. So Antipter, Hyrcanus, now go. The irony is, they went to the same Arab king. If you remember, I told you that Aristobulus threatened his mother, if you don't give me the storehouses, the fortresses of the Hashmonaim, if you don't give me the treasure of the Hashmonaim, I'm going to go to this Arab king, Aretas, and I'm going to make an alliance with him and make a civil war. And because Shlomtziyon didn't want that civil war, she gave Aristobulus the storehouses and the treasures, the fortresses. Now, Antipter and Hyrcanus ally themselves, they make themselves allies with that same Arab king, Aretas. The same one. Is very ironic, and you see like how things fly back in your own face. You know what I mean? Like if a person is if a person's going to be disloyal, then people will be disloyal. Then the people he's relying on are going to be disloyal to him. If a person's going to be deceitful, then he's going to be deceived. That's how God works. It's called measure for measure. How what we give out is what comes back to us every single time. So Aristobulus was giving out that he's going to create the civil war and ally himself with this Arab king. And what came back in his face? A civil war with this Arab king fighting against him. Now, why did the Arab king, Aretas, get involved? Probably because, again, from all the enemies of the Jews only stood to gain from a civil war. Because obviously they all understood that in the end of the day, what's going to be the product? a very, very weak Judea. Meaning whoever won, if Hyrcanus won, great, for sure I'm in control. And if in the end of the day Aristobulus wins after a lot of fighting, Judea is so weak, no problem. We can anyway walk all over her, which is exactly, unfortunately, what happened. So Aretas, this Arab king, Antipter ha-Edomi, the schemer behind this whole thing, and Hyrcanus create a civil war against Aristobulus. Now again, who was the righteous one here? Neither of them. No side is the side of the righteous versus the side of the non-righteous here, right? I mean, again, if we think of that, like, again, it's very, as I'm saying, it's very ironic that Aristobulus seizes the throne, and then in our heads, we're like, okay, good, let him have the throne and let him have peace. But it came back in his head that his throne now gets seized from him after a lot of fighting, a lot of pain, and a lot of loss of Jewish life. So Aretas, with his huge army, after gaining this promise from Hyrcanus that he would get back all the cities that his father, that's 2 kings ago, Yanai, then Shlomtziyon, and now Aristobulus Hyrcanus. So Yanai, if you remember, I said Shlomtziyon did not make these fights, did not make these wars to conquer other territory. He wasn't looking for it. But Yanai, for 27 years, had done a lot of conquering with his mercenary army. So Yanai had conquered many cities, many areas from this Arab king, Aretas. So Aretas said to Hyrcanus, I'll support you. My army will be your army. We will get you back your throne on condition that I get back all my cities. Now, of course, Hyrcanus said yes, because, like, in a sense, what did he care? Otherwise, he'd have no chance at the throne. And of course, our assumption is that Aretas wasn't just planning on taking back his cities. He was planning on grabbing whatever he could, if not the whole Judea. Who knows? Maybe the whole Judea he would have conquered. He was going to do whatever he could once he has this strong army that's hopefully going to win this war. Aretas was not doing it for any desire to help anyone, and neither was Antipter ha-Edomi. Of course, in a sense, neither was Hyrcanus. He was just this puppet convinced he should be the king. So this massive army is marching now on Jerusalem, is marching now on Aristobulus, who has his army, but his army is not as big as Aretas's army. Remember, he had told his mother, if you don't give me what I want, I'm going to get Aretas to side with me. Meaning that's the army that's going to support me. Well, guess what? Fell back in your own face. Now Aretas's army is fighting against you. So Aretas and his army are marching on Jerusalem. At this point, even though Hyrcanus was officially the more righteous, if you will, of the 2 brothers, which officially he was originally, and Shlomtziyon thought he should be the king, which meant she definitely thought he was the more righteous of the 2, or definitely the one that would more listen to the sages. But at the end of the day, the Jewish people were like, what's going on? This foreign army is attacking us? Meaning even the Jews, and I'm just trying to explain the dynamics going on here. Aristobulus was more of a Tzadduki than not. He wasn't really a Tzadduki, but he was more in the Tzadduki camp. So if it had just been a conflict between Hyrcanus and Aristobulus, the majority of the people who were righteous would have sided with Hyrcanus. They knew that Hyrcanus was appointed by his mother, their beloved former queen. They knew that Hyrcanus was closer to the sages. They knew that Hyrcanus was going to listen to the sages. So if it had just been a war like that, the people would have sided with Hyrcanus, and Aristobulus would have had his army of the Tzaddukim and whoever in the conflict. But now it became very different. Because now Hyrcanus was not at all listening to the sages. Obviously, if he had consulted with the sages would have said, no. We don't want to put you on as a puppet with Antipter ha-Edomi as the ruler and Aretas grabbing as much as he can of Judea. No. But Hyrcanus wasn't consulting with the sages. He wasn't truly righteous. He just would have been pliable enough, weak enough to be reliant on the sages' authority. But here, when he had Antipter as his backbone, he disregarded the sages completely. So now when Hyrcanus, officially Hyrcanus, is coming with this army of Aretas, of the Arab army on Jerusalem, the people, the mass of people sided with Aristobulus. They're like, what, this Gaisha army is now coming and attacking us? Hyrcanus is now taking on Tiptar Hadomi and Aritas, the Arab king, and they're going to be the rulers over us? No way. So the people who probably in a different scenario would have sided with Hyrcanus and not Aristobulus, but in this situation, they sided with Aristobulus. At the same time, again, this is a little bit complex. I'm trying to explain. I see that our time's a little over, but let me at least try to get to a little conclusion here. We're not going to conclude the story. It's a long, very, very tragic story. But just to get to this point, at the same time, of course, there were Jews in Hyrcanus's army. There were his supporters. There were people who, for whatever reason, felt that they were aligning himself with him. So we have two armies now. We have the majority of the Jews with Aristobulus behind the walls of Jerusalem, relying on the strength of the fortress of those walls to protect them. We have the army of Hyrcanus, which doesn't mean Hyrcanus, which means Antiptar Hadomi, his money, his ability to buy soldiers, and Aritas's army attacking. But within Hyrcanus's army, there were also Jews who, for whatever reason, were aligning themselves with Hyrcanus. So we have almost Jew against Jew, but really the majority of the Jews were with Aristobulus, and outside was really basically an Arab army attacking them. And this went on for years. This sieging and fighting went on for 5 years. For 5 years, more people are dying, more people are dying, more people are dying, and the people inside are not going to give in. They're like, no way, we're not giving in. And the Arab army outside was like, no way, we're not going to give in. We're eventually going to get you. And this went on and on and on. Now, what's very interesting, I'll just end on this point, because I think it still shows, however bad we're seeing it, that doesn't take away the enormous righteousness of so many of the Jewish people. Unfortunately, not the leaders, because, of course, power corrupts. So it's unfortunately not so uncommon that the leaders are corrupt as the majority of the people are actually, very, very good, very righteous. So how righteous were the Jews? During this 5-year siege, they did not stop once offering the sacrifices. So imagine every day there's a concept of like 2 sheep that are offered every day. The first morning offering, for which we pray the shacharis, the morning prayers, and the afternoon offering, for which we pray the mincha prayer. That's 2 animals. Where in the world do they have these animals from? There was a siege, a 5-year siege, and they weren't eating meat. How did they every day for 5 years offer the 2 animals? So you know what happened? There were soldiers in Hyrcanus's army, Jewish soldiers, that said, what? The service is going to stop in the temple? No way. So they would lower in baskets every day these sheep. And the priests would every day offer them, because God forbid, yes, there's people that are hungry outside, but God forbid that we should stop serving God. We know that's the key to everything. Now, on one hand, these soldiers from Hyrcanus there were many that, again, that really felt sincerely, we don't want the sacrifices to stop. But there were also people there that had power that wanted a lot of money out of it. So what they would do is they would demand from the priests, we're lowering you a basket with 2 sheep and whatever other sacrifices they needed. Obviously, it was during the holidays. I mean, Sukkot, they needed many, many, many more. I'm just saying 2 sheep as the standard daily offering. This went on for 5 years. And you're going to take from all the treasures of the coffers of the temple and fill those baskets with those treasures. And that's what they did every single day. The soldiers lowered down the animals, whatever animals were needed, and the priests filled the baskets with however much money was required, and that's what they did every single day for 5 years. I mean, once their animals ran out. For 5 years, they did this as the siege went on for 5 years, which is an amazing testimony to a lot of things. It's an amazing thing that you see that this was a priority for them, which of course echoes in modern times. And if you go to the Holocaust or other situations where Jews are in such deprivation, but how they emphasize whatever else is going on, we can't stop serving God. If it's a time when we can't stop teaching the children Torah, or for women, we can't stop going to mikvah. We don't want to stop eating kosher. We don't want to stop keeping Shabbos. So we see, throughout modern times as well, the Jews that are saying, we're going through hard times. There's plenty of excuses. We could have plenty of religious sanctions to drop this stuff. But this is our life. Once we drop this stuff, what's left? And therefore, despite the fact that the money was probably running out, despite the fact that they probably needed it for other things, despite the fact that there was a city that was under siege for 5 years, and I'm sure food was very scarce, but nobody disagreed with what the priests were doing. Obviously, this is very important. Obviously, we have to keep serving God, and that's the central point of all of our existence. So every day the animals would draw it down, and every day the money went up, which at the same time, again, is also showing from the side of the soldiers of Hyrcanus's army, the Jewish soldiers. Obviously, these were the Jewish soldiers that were doing it. Of course, on one hand, they were making a lot of money off of it, but on the other hand, they also had this sense of like, not a love for the other side that they were fighting for 5 years, but a sense of like, hey, that's our temple too. Hey, we don't want the priests to stop serving God. We're Jews too. And again, especially because they were aligned with this Arab army, the Jews with them really wanted to know, we're Jews too. This went on for 5 years, as the siege went on for 5 years. What happened at the end of 5 years? What happened at the end was the advisors of this Arab army, or Antiptar Hadomi army, officially with Hyrcanus around, said, wait a minute, why are the Jews holding out for 5 years? That's insane. How are they still fighting us? How come they didn't give in yet? You know why? It must be because of God. It must be because their God is helping them enough that they didn't crumble. And you know why their God must be helping them? Because they're still serving him. Forget it. The end. And once they decided this, the next day, in the basket that came down, instead of sheep or goats, was a pig. That was it. That was the end. They weren't going to offer it. I mean, once the priest saw the pig, they understood the message. The message was, we're done. We're done. And literally, that was the end. It says, when the hooves of that pig hit the temple ground, all of Israel trembled. Because that was the end. So to find out the sad end, we'll continue that next week. Of course, it wasn't the end of the Jewish people. We're alive today. Proud Jews, strong Jews, Jews that are still serving God. But on a political level, on a national level, this signified a tremendous, tremendous blow. To be continued next week. And again, even as we learn this sort of sad part of our history, and it's sad to think how Jew against Jew, it's sad to think how corruptive power is, but we can still take pride in the Jew service of God. We can take pride that for 5 years, they prioritized service of God, they prioritized those offerings, and truly they were right. Truly those offerings were, seemingly like, oh my gosh, they're crazy. They should save the money, use it for armory, use it for food, bribe them to get food for the people. What are they doing? Burning animals to ash for God every day. But they were right. That was really their protection. Sometimes we think, oh, we're so great, we prioritize God when people would think we shouldn't. We should only know how that's our strength and our salvation, just as it was theirs, just as historically always has been. When you prioritize God and you put him first, even if it doesn't seem logical, even if you could get an excuse not to, that's the source of strength. That's the source of salvation. And when that stops, then everything crumbles. To be continued. Have a wonderful week. We should see God's hand in the revealed way, in the way we're looking for, in absolute revealed good.
Amen.
Thank you.
Amen. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for joining. Thank you for joining. Thank you for joining. Thank you, Bella. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Sava. Thank you, Batsheva.
Thank you.
You.